This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, another conversation with Luke Healy. Greetings, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and today I'm pleased to be talking with Luke Healy. His new book, Permanent Press, was just released from Avery Hill Publishing, and I talk with Luke extensively about this thought-provoking and self-reflexive work. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find incredible savings on a variety of comics. And you can be assured that in the month of July, you can find great prices on bundles of comics from publishers such as Marvel, DC, and Valiant. And, of course, there are the usual specials on individual issues and single volumes. Prices you just can't beat anywhere else. Do you like mainstream titles? Are your tastes more akin to the indie and small press side of things? Whatever kind of comics you enjoy reading, you'll always find unbeatable prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I first met Luke Healy at Small Press Expo in 2016, and while there I talked with him about his provocative self-published mini-comic, The Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion, which was nominated that year for an Ignatz Award. A couple of months later, I was lucky to have Luke back on the show, this time for a long and more in-depth interview about his new book at the time, How to Survive in the North, which was released from Nobrow Press. And today, I'm glad to have him back on the Comics Alternative to discuss his most recent work. He has a brand new book that revisits some of his older writings and places them within an entirely new context. Permanent Press has just been released from Avery Hill Publishing, and it's a mock autobiographical text that explores the world of independent comics creators and the relationship between a cartoonist and his ego. What's more, the new book incorporates the previously self-published The Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion, but it does so in a way that brings a fresh perspective to the story and even underscores its experimental nature. In the interview you're about to hear, I talk with Luke about the origins of Permanent Press, its highly satirical tone, and the process of looking inside of himself and pulling out a narrative that's not entirely autobiographical, but at the same time not purely fiction. As you'll hear, Luke is certainly one of the medium's most meditative creators. Let's listen to that conversation now. Hey, Luke, welcome back to the Comics Alternative.
Hey, thank you very much for having me back. I'm happy to talk to you again.
Yeah, it is nice to talk again. And, we're primarily going to talk about your new book, Permanent Press, but we can talk about a variety of other things as well. For listeners of the podcast who may not be aware, you and I had an interview not quite 2 years ago. It was back in November 2016. I remember it being right after our presidential elections because we made a couple of comments about it at the time.
Yeah, that's quite a sort of like chronological landmark. It's hard to forget that one.
It is, and it's like a major tragedy, like where were you when JFK was shot, or where were you when the Twin Towers went down? For us here in the U.S. and probably worldwide, where were you when Donald Trump was elected?
I remember well myself. I was eating Japanese food. It suddenly tasted much worse than it had right before.
But we had also spoken for the podcast, albeit briefly, earlier in 2016 at Small Press Expo. I remember talking with you at your table for a few minutes. And at the time, I think we were discussing briefly your Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion, which had been nominated for an Ignatz Award. But the really beefy first interview that we had was in November of that year.
Yeah, that all sounds right. I remember talking to you at SPX. That was quite an odd festival that year. Or I guess for me it was odd because I was like coming out of like living in a tent in the woods for 5 months. So I remember just like talking to you and talking to everybody and just being totally overwhelmed by the fact that I was in a crowd of other human people. So I can't imagine what I gave you was very coherent on that occasion.
Well, one of the things I found about SPX, especially over the past few years, is that they have become more and more populated, very crowded. And so I can just imagine how overwhelming that was for you after having spent so much time alone by yourself in wide open areas during your hike on the west coast of the U.S.
Yeah, it was a big change, but it was fun. It was great. It was kind of a nice ending to that whole time in the USA because I just got to see all of my friends at once, in a big room.
Now, do you plan on coming back to SPX this year or coming to the U.S. for any convention in the coming months?
I don't. I'm sort of avoiding going to the US at the moment, not to sound like too the political straight off the bat, but yeah, like I'm not interested in going to the US while the current administration is in power, and lending my tourist money to the economy. In fact, there's a big protest in London where I live next week about Trump's official state visit to the UK, and I'll be in that holding a sign. So probably not for a few more years in the USA, I'm afraid.
Okay, and I honestly don't blame you at all. And I hadn't intended our interview to start off in such a political manner, but it's just, really, it's one of those unavoidable things in our current reality that whether you like it or not, it's something that you need to either confront or at least acknowledge in some way or another. But
yeah, it's in the air, certainly.
Yeah, and I feel like when it comes to my friends and acquaintances who don't live in the U.S., whether it be overseas or in Canada, that I need to maybe start off our conversation by apologizing for the U.S. right now. So let me say, before we get into a discussion of permanent press, I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you so much. You know what? Apology not necessary, but deeply appreciated.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into, I guess, a more enjoyable part of our talk,
yes,
which is on your new book, Permanent Press. This comes out, in fact, it's just come out in the United States as we're recording this, but the book actually debuted in, you were telling me before I turned on the mics, in Dublin in April of this year, correct?
Yes, yeah, the Dublin Comic Arts Festival. There was like a little, very subdued launch for the book there in April.
Oh, well, how did that go?
It was good, people were very nice about it. Avery Hill, who is the publisher, they all came over to Dublin for like one night to just do this event. And yeah, I think they had a good time. It was very positive. It was odd though. It was like held in, there's like this big, enormous youth hostel in the center of Dublin. And so we were sort of like selling comics at these tables, and there were people like coming and going with like beers in their hands and like huge backpacks all day. It was an odd atmosphere, but very positive overall.
So it's been out in Ireland, in the UK, and my guess is on the continent for several months now. And I'm wondering what kind of critical response you've noticed to Permanent Press since it was released back in April.
Generally pretty positive, which is nice because I was really nervous about sort of sharing this book with people because it is a bit odd. And it's also the first time that I've really tried to make work that is like funny, that's like explicitly comedy, at least in parts. And so I was so nervous that people wouldn't find it funny and they would just be like, this is weird. Like, what is this? What am I reading? But overall, there's been a pretty positive response. Gotten some good reviews. Got reviewed by Publishers Weekly positively, which is always nice. And yeah, so I'm pretty happy with the critical response. I'm just especially relieved that people found it funny.
Yeah. You said that it's kind of an unusual book, which is interesting because I remember our earlier discussion on your last book, How to Survive in the North, which came out from Nobrow. We were talking about that as an unusual narrative because what you did was you took two historically based events, two expeditions, and then you melded that, or even, I guess, framed it, maybe a better way of putting it, with a fictional story. And the way that we were discussing How to Survive in the North, you presented both of those historical expeditions, one in 1913, I believe, and the other in 1921, in such a way that they seemed to almost meld one into the other. And then you tempered the historical aspect with this fictional story of a researcher at Dartmouth. And I thought that was an unusual move overall.
Oh, yeah. I think that book, there definitely was, I would say, there was some like experimentation with plot, I guess, or the plot structure of the book. That was like, it was really like a theme driven plot, I guess, but it was nonfiction, so that was a little bit unusual. But I think like in terms of sheer like bombast, I guess, this new book, Permanent Press, like really turns up the volume, at least in my opinion. That is, I guess, for readers to decide. But it's really it's because it's a satire. It really just like goes in hard, I think, on like mocking a lot of the things that I love so much about like literature and comics. Like if How to Survive in the North is like a straightforward sort of like literary comic with, like aspirations of experimental structure, I think Permanent Press is like a big like big red tongue sticking out of somebody's mouth blowing a raspberry at the sort of pretension of trying to make literary work, I guess.
Yeah, and I look at some of your comics, and our listeners can find some of your shorter works online on your website at lukehealy.com. And I see some of them, such as your piece that appeared in the Nib not quite 2 years ago, For Gus, How Far Would You Travel to Say Goodbye? That's more or less kind of a straightforward and autobiographical narrative, but in some of the longer form work that you've done, definitely with Permanent Press, I think How to Survive in the North, and I would even say with your mini comic, the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, in great detail, which is embedded in Permanent Press. Your style of storytelling is quite experimental, and not only in terms of the structure of the narrative, but in the art style as well, and what you incorporate. Like, for instance, with Cuckoo's Nest, you use not only illustrations, but also photographs.
Yes, yeah. Well, Cuckoo's Nest is like an interesting comic to me still, because I look at it and I'm like jealous that I can't like do that again, basically, because I think I wrote and sort of like did all of the planning for Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion while I was drawing How to Survive in the North, which took like almost 2 years. It was such a long process where all of the creative choices were already made, and I was literally just illustrating from templates and thumbnails the final art for that comic. So I had all this writing energy built up where I just like knew things that I wanted to do, all of these little like gimmicks and tricks that I in the past, if I wasn't working on such a big book, I would have just taken one of these like tricks or gimmicks and put it into like a really short comic, something that's maybe 12 pages, something like that. But I didn't have time to do any extra drawing, so they all sort of accumulated, and I just incorporated them all into one story. So it is a comic that has a lot of moving parts, and I'm satisfied that it like all comes together, at least in my opinion. But it was definitely a interesting thing to work on at the time, and I still like looking back on it and reading it.
Now, so far we've been talking around Permanent Press. Let's really dive right in. When you describe Permanent Press to someone who hasn't read it yet but may be interested in it, how do you describe it?
So I call it a satire of the comics industry or the independent comics industry, or sort of like a humor book about trying to be a working artist. But basically, it's like the okay, I'll break it down, the sort of like plot of the book, although the book is not very plot focused. The book is about a cartoonist called Luke Healy, it's fictional, but it's obviously named after me, who comes down with an existential disease called metaphoritis, where all of these like hack literary metaphors start invading his life. Like his shadow comes to life and starts giving him advice, and he slowly starts transforming into a cartoon rat. And his father takes him for a walk in a hedge maze. All this sort of like very blunt metaphor starts invading his life. And his response to this is to make these two comics that appear in full in the book. The first one is the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion, and the second one is a story called The Big and Small. And the sort of idea is that the Luke character in Permanent Press has made these two comics, and through reading his work, you understand his psychology. But mostly it's just an excuse to like tell lots and lots of jokes. So it sounds really complicated, but I don't think when you're reading it, it's all that complicated. Really, I think it's pretty easy to follow.
Yeah, it is, and also quite fun. And you mentioned metaphoritis. There's one part toward the end of the book where the Luke Healy character, who is undergoing some kind of transformation, we can discuss this in a moment, goes to the doctor, and the doctor diagnoses him as having metaphoritis, and he describes it as, he says, it's a textbook case, really. Affects a lot of hack writers. It's rarely terminal. Your ego would have to be colossal for you to be in any real danger. And so not only are you satirizing the independent comics industry collective, but you're also poking fun at yourself.
Oh, fully. It's I think, like, I sometimes think of this book as like a portrait of me when I'm like 22, I'm like really hungry for people to read my work and to like praise me and talk about how great I am. And it really is like a sort of undressing of all of those egotistical, immature wants and needs. Not to say that I don't have those impulses now. I think they guide my behavior a lot less. I still want people to read my work and to enjoy it, but I think I was so hungry then that it was basically absurd, which is kind of the point of the book, is like the Luke character's behavior is just so absurd. And what I like about Permanent Press, or what I hope people take away from it when they read it, is like it does have a very sort of like heady structure. There's a lot of bits in it, and you've got to pay attention as you're reading it. But I use that structure basically as just a vessel for like very silly jokes, usually at my own expense. And I think that's really what I hope people enjoy most about reading the book.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you mentioned, there are two comics narratives that are embedded in Permanent Press. The first one is the piece that you wrote a few years ago, as you mentioned, the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion. And then the other one is The Big and Small. Now, when you were originally working on Cuckoo's Nest, did you at all envision that it would be included in a longer work such as this?
No, not really. I pitched Cuckoo's Nest to publishers as a standalone thing, because I am very proud of it. But I think in general, publishers weren't interested because it's so short. It's about 60 pages, which is long for a mini comic, but it's hard to get something that's 60 pages onto a bookshop shelf. And my initial idea then, when I decided that I wasn't done with Cuckoo's Nest, was I wanted to put it in a short story collection. And so I started working on The Big and Small as sort of a response comic to Cuckoo's Nest. Cuckoo's Nest is a very verbal comic. It's all about communication and miscommunication through words and art. And The Big and Small was supposed to be a counterpoint to that, using numbers as the lens through which to view the world. And my initial plan was to make The Big and Small and then package them together as two comics. But when Avery Hill approached me and said that they were interested in publishing The Big and Small, I sort of had this idea that I wanted to put them together with this extra narrative to really like unify everything to the best of my ability, because I became less and less interested in just two stories that are parallel that have like a thematic connection, and I wanted to include it all in one sort of like big narrative that really attacks and explores like certain themes like again and again and again as you read through it.
Mm-hmm. And so the binding element, so to speak, is this mock or satirical, autobiographical story that brings everything together and that includes both Cuckoo's Nest and The Biggest and the Small as part of its storyline.
Yeah, that's the intention. And I think, I in general, I do have sort of like a little bit of an issue with stories that have these sort of framing narratives, because it sometimes feels like, oh, well, the part that is the framing narrative is the only part that like counts, quote unquote, because it's the only part that's like real. And so I deliberately, to avoid that sort of idea, I made the framing narrative in this the most sort of like absurd and magical, whereas the other two stories are quite mundane. And I on top of that, I'm not that interested in plot in my work. And so I think like in this book, what matters least is the plot. Like the book, I think the humor, the themes, the characters, the style of it, I think they're more key than the plot. And so I hoped that by minimizing plot, I would sort of like avoid robbing the stakes of the other two stories.
So we know that the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion was its own text, a mini comic, a few years before the release of Permanent Press. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, is this the first time readers are seeing The Big and Small, or might have The Big and Small appeared elsewhere before Permanent Press?
So I published about half of The Big and Small on Twitter online. And that's how Dave from Avery Hill, ended up seeing it and contacting me about publishing it.
Oh, wow.
But it changed a lot from that version. So I published maybe the first 20 pages, maybe a little bit less than that on Twitter, and that included some of the framing narrative stuff because that intercuts with The Big and Small. But when I decided when I talked with Avery Hill and we decided to make it one big book, it was like significantly revised. So in this form, like Cuckoo's Nest remains basically unchanged, but The Big and Small is fairly extensively revised for this edition.
I want to go more into The Big and Small, but I want to back up a bit to ask you about what you were saying about Twitter. It's interesting in that you chose Twitter as the social networking site platform to use. From my experience, most creators, when they're releasing their material, maybe test driving it, if you want to call it that, they do so via Instagram, which is a much more visual social media platform, or even something like Tumblr. I'm curious why you chose Twitter.
I can't really remember why I chose Twitter. I think Twitter is just the one that I am most active on and that I use the most. I have the most followers there. And I bet, I'm not 100% sure because I don't remember, but I bet it was following the lead of Michael DeForge, who's published a lot on Twitter. I really like his comics. And he published his whole comic, Leaving Richards Valley, on Twitter.
Okay. Now getting back to The Big and Small. So you say that those who follow you on Twitter, for all practical purposes, got to see about half of this story before Permanent Press.
Yeah, about half.
Yeah. Now, one of the differences I noticed between the way you embed Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion and then The Big and Small is that with the former, you more or less present it in this new book, Permanent Press, in its entirety. In other words, you start off Permanent Press with this kind of mock satirical, autobiographical framing part of the narrative. Then the Luke Healy character shows to his shadow companion, and I want to talk about him in a minute, the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion, we get that. And then we move on to the other parts of, the mock autobiography and then the big and small. But with the big and small, it's interesting in that you do something different. We get segments of the story, the big and small, interspersed with more autobiographical parts of Permanent Press. And I'm wondering why you chose to break up the big and the small as a story with the fictional Luke Healy's own story, but not doing so with the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion.
Yeah. So in the original draft of Big and Small, that was not connected to Cuckoo's Nest other than in this vague thematic way. There were these sort of meta textual elements where there was the fictional Luke Healy. We would cut to him and the shadow, and they would be doing their thing. And so those pages, I did publish a couple of those even on Twitter. I think I got that far into it. But the idea is that when we're seeing it as part of Permanent Press, it's a comic that's in progress, because the way that... So in Permanent Press, there's a section right at the top where it's this fake autobiographical stuff. Then there's Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion in its entirety. And there's more fake autobiographical stuff. And then there's Big and Small, which is intercut with the fake autobiographical stuff. But I wanted it to be so that the Cuckoo's Nest was basically the big statement of what the Luke Healy character thought, what his sort of point of view was in Permanent Press. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied even breaking this down. And then I wanted the Big and Small to react to have interactions with the Luke Healy character's progress, because that's at the point where he starts changing, I guess. As part of the metaphor of him transforming into a rat, but also where his point of view or perspective changes a little bit. And I wanted to show the relationship between the work that he was making and his life. And so we get this Big and Small comic broken up so we can jump back and forth to see how the text is influenced by his life and how his life is influenced by the text. And then that comic sort of peters off and it's never really finished. As you get towards the end of it, you sort of see pages that are more work in progress pages.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the idea, is that in the narrative of the press, that comic is never finished and it's never, reproduced and bound into a little book like Cuckoo's Nest is. But the meta stuff was always in there from the beginning.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about the Big and Small story is that you're dealing with relationships, but in different ways than you did with the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion, because with Cuckoo's Nest, we have, I guess, the main character is a playwright by the name of Robin Huang, and then the people that she works with, specifically the novelist A.B. Cadbury, whose text is actually being adapted to stage by Robin. Then there's Robin's daughter, Natalie, a guy who works with the setting named Wally, and then the producer, Benjamin. And of course, as you state, the reader becomes a character within Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion. And so you have interesting relationships among these various characters. But with Big and Small, you have two guys, one named Amir and another one Mo. They do interact, but not that often. And it seems that the Big and the Small as a story is more about not so much interaction, but in terms of personality contrast more than anything. Yeah,
I think the Big and Small is a much more, I guess, didactic story, in the sense that there is a lot of narration text that sort of explains what's going on. But I knew that I wanted to look at how two people's lives could be contrasted just by using the numbers in their world, so there's little sections where it talks about, how many inches their shower heads are up from the floor and what angle they pointed up. And how many, they both make YouTube videos and how many views do each of their videos get, how many comments, stuff like that, their height, their weight, just all these little numbers. And I just wanted to use this technique of just listing all of these stats as a way to contrast people's lives, just sort of use it as a lens.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're pretty. The two stories are pretty different. Also, the characters in The Big and Small, they, like I said, they make YouTube videos, and they're sort of like isolated people, and so they don't interact with anybody all that much, really. And so there's a part in the story where they get trapped in a lift together, and that's sort of like the most time that they've spent with other people in their week, probably. And so there is a very different feeling, I think, to that story than Cuckoo's Nest, which is all about people sort of like clashing and being forced together all the time.
Right. And also, along with that, it's the way that one form of artistic expression can be either successfully or otherwise translated into another platform, and the people who attempt to bring this about. So, I mean, obviously in the Unofficial Cuckoo's Nest Study Companion, you're going for, I guess, more heady territory, so to speak. But one of the things that struck me about The Big and Small, you mentioned YouTube, and I want to come back to social media. We were talking about Twitter earlier. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe you were making some kind of commentary on the uses of certain platforms like YouTube in your story of Amir and Mo.
Sure. Well, I think that, I'm fascinated by social media. A lot of my work actually is weirdly about the internet. Probably because I spend too much time using it. But I think that I love YouTube. I'm really obsessed with it. And I'm obsessed with YouTube rabbit holes. And so I'll get sucked down. My current crazy obsession is this guy who records himself for an hour at a time playing this game where he gets dropped into a random spot on Google Maps and has to figure out where he is based on the street view pictures, so things like that. And the story in The Big and Small, both of the YouTube channels that Mo and Amir run are fairly niche. And they're both to do with food. One very, very small amounts of food, one big amounts of food. Hence the size comparison theme running through that text. But yeah, I think YouTube is a really interesting art platform, I guess. And so I purposefully included sort of something that would be considered lowbrow art in The Big and Small story to contrast the highbrow art, quote unquote, that's in Cuckoo's Nest, which is all about a novel and a play. And so I wanted to just throw in another sort of avenue that people can be creative in to bring it into the conversational soup of the book.
Yeah, and I have to be honest, I didn't even know that mukbang videos were that big of a deal until reading the Big and Small part of Permanent Press, because both Mo and Amir do mukbang videos where they
they're really weird.
Record themselves eating.
Yeah, it's such a huge thing on YouTube that I don't even know how I found it, but it's a very odd thing where people just set up a camera and they'll eat in front of it, and the videos get millions of views.
Wow. Yeah, I find that fascinating in that, as a podcaster, and by the way, we do have a YouTube channel. Now, our video is static, but people can listen to the Comics Alternative via our YouTube channel, and a number do. But I find it interesting and at times kind of frustrating that while on the one hand, we attempt to put out quality content where we, analyze comics, we have in-depth interviews such as this one, roundtable discussions and what have you, and we don't get near the traffic as, let's say, a particular YouTuber on his or her channel eating food, which I don't know. And there's something to that. On the other hand, it's wow, how do they get millions of views and we don't get near that amount?
It is odd. That's partially why I'm so fascinated by it. I think it has a lot to do with just some people have a weird raw charisma to them. And it's there's the expression, oh, I would listen to you read a phone book. It's kind of that, it's some people are just oddly magnetic and people will watch them do anything. And that includes sitting down and eating a meal, even if they're silently doing it. It's really, I'm fascinated by these videos, but I don't watch them, I don't spend my time watching people eat, I'm more fascinated by the idea of them.
Wow. Okay. Now you have given me an idea for my next, let's say, video podcast, which can also be a YouTube channel where I will read through a phone book.
Oh, great. Yeah. That sounds really fun.
Yes. But getting back to Permanent Press, so we have this story, The Big and Small, embedded, I guess, in the last half of Permanent Press. And as you described it, this story is kind of breaks down toward the end and becomes incomplete, but it's also interspersed with the kind of crazy autobiographical stuff that you do. And I want to talk about the autobiographical or mock autobiographical elements of Permanent Press, because when we see the Luke Healy character in his shadow at first, we see, as you described him, kind of a younger creator who is rather self-obsessed and self-conscious and is worried that he's not getting the kind of attention that he feels that he deserves and that he had at one point early in his career gotten, because the Luke Healy character does mention to his shadow, hey, I've won an award, but I haven't in a while, and what's the matter with me?
Yeah, he's obsessed with having won that award.
Okay, so the shadow, that makes sense to me as a companion or sounding board for the Luke Healy character. And at one point, the shadow even says, I think this is toward the end of the book, once the Luke Healy character begins to transform because of metaphoritis, the shadow says that, in so many words, we're two shitty metaphors.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's it, right? Like, it's sort of supposed to all be a big joke. I mean, partially the fact that he has a talking shadow is like supposed to be like archly cliche. But more than that, it is supposed to be a bit of a commentary on, certainly on my own work, but I think as well on other creators' work, where they'll often write like a duo of characters that are both just so clearly their points of view, or their sort of like conflicting points of view that they like use to have their intellectual arguments. I know I certainly do that in my comics. Like, all of the characters are just me, basically, unless I'm doing nonfiction. And so it is supposed to be like slightly a joke about that. And as well, something that I found like amusing as I was writing it is that the shadow character, I think often people use like a shadow as like a symbol of depression or like anxiety, something like that.
Or the darker side of them.
Yeah, exactly. But in Permanent Press, the like shadow is very practical and positive, or I guess not positive, but he's like the practical, sort of like realistic, sensible one, whereas the Luke Healy character is this like crazy, egotistical, like maniac who is just ranting and raving the whole book. Which is definitely, they're like the two sides of my personality for sure, because I can get unfortunately self-important at times. But I think that, on a day-to-day, if you were to talk to me, the shadow character is like much more like how I am in real life.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I noticed about the autobiographical part of Permanent Press, or the mock autobiographical part, is after we get the unofficial Cuckoo's Nest study companion in full, then the Luke Healy character and his shadow, they go to a con. Luke is rather frustrated by some of the things that happens, not only in terms of trying to get attention for his own art, but also meeting a hero of his, which becomes anticlimactic. But then afterwards, Luke says he wants to get out. He wants to get some fresh air. He wants to get away from comics. And he and the shadow go out for months into the outdoors. Now, earlier we were talking about your hiking from a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, when you came to the west coast of the U.S. How much of this mock autobiography in Permanent Press is not so mock in terms of reflecting some of your own past experiences with your art and even wanting to get away from it?
Oh, it's all fictional, I guess, quote unquote, but it's fully making fun of me. There's a lot of inside jokes that I think maybe just myself or my close friends would get. But like, the going out into nature, that's like in the book Permanent Press, that's another symptom of his metaphoritis, and that it's like very corny to like go out and be like, well, I'm going to find myself like in the natural world. But I really did that. And I didn't do it because I had an awkward interaction at a comics festival. It wasn't really to do with that, but it is like gently ribbing my own choices. In fact, the sequence in the book where the Luke character goes to a comics convention, which is supposed to be SPX basically, and then sits in a toilet stall next to a cartooning hero of his who like poops really loudly, which is the level where the humor is at in this book. Like that really happened, It wasn't quite as absurd, but it was like an odd moment. I think it was the first SPX I went to, and I won't say who it was, but
I was going to ask you who that hero was.
I'm not going to tell you, and the drawing does not look like what they look like in real life.
Okay.
But it was like it was just like, oh, cool. There's a person who's like comics I've read for 5 years. And then I was sitting next to them in the toilet stall, and they were just like farting up a storm. So all of the autobiographical stuff comes from a real place, but it's more like a self-portrait than a memoir, I guess. It's more interpretive.
Right. Maybe a self-portrait reflected through a funhouse mirror.
Yeah, definitely. It's a cartoon, it's like the cartoon version of true events, I guess.
Yeah. And I find it interesting also that, after the Luke character goes out for a few months into the outdoors and feels that he has, I guess, divorced himself from his obsession with comics. He comes back with the shadow to his apartment. He's wearing, I guess, it looks like the skin of a boar that he killed.
Yeah.
And the first thing he does, the shadow goes to take a shower because, he's been outside for months. But then Luke sits down at his computer, does a Google search for Luke Healy comics, comes up with 0 results. I don't know, hilarious. I mean,
I wish that wasn't based so much on real truth, but I Google myself a lot. I'm an egotist.
Mm-hmm. So, but then we have, and I don't want to give too much away in terms of Permanent Press, especially toward the end, but the Luke character, as we've mentioned, he learns from metaphoritis, which becomes more of an outward physical change that he undergoes.
Yes, yeah, he turns into a rat.
Okay.
A cartoon rat. Yeah, you can give it away. I think there's a rat on the cover of the book. I think that what I like about Permanent Press, and I did give myself sort of like a get out of jail free card with this book, but the plot, quote unquote, of the book is about corny metaphors, I guess. And so I sort of have that past to be like, oh, well, that was part of the intention of the book, is that it's a little corny. But I think that there's not much plot to this book. Saying, what happens, I don't think that spoils the book in any way. I think the experience of reading it is not really about, learning. I don't think, at least in my opinion, I don't think anybody's reading the book being like, whoa, what happens next?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there is this transformation into a rat, and you're right. There is on the cover of the book a rat sitting on top of a washing machine that's open and the water's pouring out, which leads me to my next question, and that is, why the title Permanent Press?
Yeah. Okay. So Permanent Press, I've really wanted to use that as a title for a long time. And I think that I'm happy to have saved it for this book, but I mean, it's a term that's on washing machines. It's like a type of washing machine cycle for clothes that are permanent press clothes. But in the book, the Luke character is trying to make a comic that will win all these awards and be remembered. So in that sense, it's a piece of permanent press, as in permanent publication. But also the sort of wordplay of the title runs throughout the book. There's a lot of dinky jokes about it. The first line of the book, I believe, is he says, "I'm washed up," which is sort of a joke about having a washing machine on the cover.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I didn't even think about that.
I just like the title. Yeah. There's a bunch of them in there. If you read it again ever, keep your eyes open for jokes about washing machines. There's a few in there.
And cleaning things okay, that's interesting. Okay, so Permanent Press is roughly about 130, 140 pages long, right?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And your previous book was also a long form narrative. And I remember when we spoke back in November of 2016, because that's about 200 pages or so, that you were saying that at the time, How to Survive in the North is your first longer form narrative. In other words, something longer than 50 pages. Now, do you find yourself still wanting to explore the longer form style of comic storytelling and maybe less time doing shorter mini comics?
Yeah, I'd say so. I'm interested in what you can do with a long form comic, just what you can do with the space, I guess. I've never been that good at being concise, but my inclination is always to make longer form work. The book I'm working on right now, actually, my next book is like 350 pages, so that's like a real chunky book.
Now the longest, yeah.
Yeah, it's a long one. And it's a lot of work, but it's worth it. You know, I am working on a mini comic at the moment called The Peeping Tom, but it's hard. I mean, like the reality is that it's hard to justify working on mini comics from an economic standpoint. I like them. I like the format. I like making short stories, but it's hard to make money off mini comics. I mean, it's hard to make money off longer form comics too, but it's easier. You know, if you sign a book deal, you get an advance, and that helps pay for your time in making the book. So, you know, the equivalent amount of work is obviously enormous. You know, it's a lot of work to make a 200 or a 300 page book, but the financial rewards, at least for me, are, you know, by orders of magnitude bigger, because I basically have like never made money off selling mini comics. Some people are really good at it, and they can do that. They're really great at the self-publishing thing, and I've never excelled at that. I find it very difficult.
So, okay, tell us a little bit about this mini comic that you just mentioned that you're currently working on.
Sure. So it's called The Peeping Tom. I have been publishing it on Twitter as well, although I've taken the last month off to concentrate on some other work. I'm getting started again soon. And it's an autobiographical comic about gentrification in East London, where I moved about a year ago. And the story of the book is about a flat that I moved into where the landlord was in conflict with one of the tenants and was trying to evict her. And so it tells that story about her eventual eviction, and it contrasts it beside the Luke character in that book, which this one is nonfiction, walking around East London and like looking in through people's windows at night, basically. Not in like a creepy voyeuristic way, but people in London don't close their blinds, man. And so you see a lot of weird stuff in people's windows. So it uses that as sort of a way to explore the history of the area and the results of gentrification in the part of East London that I live in Dalston.
So when you mentioned that you're releasing your panels to this what will become a mini comic, a completed mini comic via Twitter. Once it's completed, will you make it available on your website along with some of the other shorter works that you have?
Yeah, I think so. My plan is to collect it in print and to post it then in full. Setting up the way I've set up my website to display my comics, like it actually takes quite a bit of work to format something into a web page for that. So I'm just going to wait till it's all done and then put it all up there collectively.
And, you know, along with that, in looking at your website, one of the things that I didn't notice, and please tell me if I overlook something, there's not a place for people who may want to get a physical copy of one of your mini comics to actually go. In other words, I don't see a link to an Etsy store or any other means for people to buy your mini comics. Although you do make them available, or at least some of them, as digital or online comics.
Yeah. The plain fact, I mean, again, it comes back to like economics, which is a boring answer, but you know, it takes a lot of time and money to keep stuff in print and to post it out to people, especially because, you know, most of the people who read my work live in the United States and I don't. So shipping is like prohibitively expensive anyway. So it just makes more sense for me to basically post all of my comics for free instead of publishing them really as mini comics, or I'll do a single edition, sell them like I did with Cuckoo's Nest. I printed an edition of it, sold them out. I did a second edition, sold them out, not that many copies. But then after that, it just made sense to put it online and, you know, let people read it for free if they were interested. And then, of course, it was collected in permanent press. But yeah, I don't know. This self-publishing game, I love it. It's exciting, but it's a lot of work. And to me, it's more important that people get to read my comics than, I make £100 off one of them, off an edition. So yeah, I guess I just give them mostly away for free.
Yeah. And you also mentioned this 300-some page project that you're working on now. And I don't want you to give anything away that you feel that you shouldn't disclose. But what can you tell us about this longer book?
I can tell you all about it. It's called Americana, and it is like a memoir about growing up obsessed with the United States of America in Ireland, and then doing this hike that we've mentioned a couple of times from Mexico to Canada in 2016. And it is, I think I can say this. Yeah, I can say this. It's coming out in 2019 from Nobrow.
Okay.
So I'm working on that at the moment, and it's a hybrid prose book and comic. So a little bit like Cuckoo's Nest, it slides in and out of using like blocks of prose text or full pages of prose text sometimes, and then sections that are comics. So it's a little bit, I guess, like Diary of a Teenage Girl by Phoebe Gloeckner, or a Posey Simmons book or something like that.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that much of it will be about the hike that you took on the Pacific Crest Trail back in summer of 2016. Mm-hmm. Will you include your comic for Gus in Americana?
It includes the events of that comic, but they're completely redone. It's like rewritten and redrawn. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And in this book, and this is kind of alludes back to an earlier comment where we started off. I mean, are you going to make observations or evaluations of where America is now in your heart, given our current political moment?
It's a pretty political book, I would say. It's definitely the point of the book, I guess, is not to provide explicit commentary, but it is to, I guess, the Luke character in that book is more of an observer. So it's more about juxtaposing sort of like facts, and then letting the readers come to their own conclusions about the like morality of the events, I guess. So something at the start of the book that I'm happy to talk about. It's in like the first 10 pages, because I started this hike at the United States-Mexico border in Southern California. And there's a huge border fence there. And so one of the first things the book does is contrast this like image of the fence with all of these like sort of freewheeling hikers starting this like journey of leisure. There's water caches all over Southern California for people who are trying to cross the border. And then there's water caches for the hikers. And, border control agents are only destroying some of those caches, and it's not the ones that are for the hikers. So it has things like that in it. While I was there in 2016, there was the shooting in Orlando. And so there's stuff about the treatment of LGBTQ people in America. And it was during the primaries. It was during the Republican and Democratic primaries. I was in California. Actually, I ended up getting sick in California and having to stay in a town for a while when Trump became the official nominee, when the other candidates dropped out. So it's a pretty political book, and it doesn't shy away from that necessarily, but it's not, the book doesn't function as an essay really. It's not really about like presenting concrete ideas. It's more about like laying out a lot of observations together and then letting the reader take what they want from it.
This is interesting in that just recently I was talking with my podcast host for the regular weekly review shows, Paul Lai, about this phenomena that we've been seeing for the past year and a half of comics that are devoted in some way or another to a more overt critique, or at least an awareness of the Trump phenomena. And I understand that there are many comics readers who don't like that. In other words, they don't like overt outward politics, quote unquote, dirtying their comics. Personally, I have no problem with it because I think that any narrative form is political by its very nature, whether unintended or otherwise. And that, whether we're talking about comics or prose fiction, television, film, or what have you, can be quite effective in terms of what it may have to say politically. As a creator, and especially as a creator who is not a United States citizen, right? But you're observing and perhaps even critiquing from the outside, what kind of responsibilities do you see yourself taking on or perhaps needing to become aware of when you write about what's going on in the U.S. right now?
I think, for me, it's just most important to be, honest, and honest about the limitations of my own perspective included in that. Because I think, like you were saying, all art is political. And I think if somebody is having this response of thinking, oh, God, I don't like how all these people are making overtly political work, et cetera, everyone's work was political before. It just was dealing with a different type of politics, which was often a politics of obliviousness. And I don't think that's quite so much an option anymore. Just the environment that these works are coming out in makes them political. If I was to write this book, 8 years ago during Obama's first term, I think people would read it and they wouldn't have that many. They wouldn't assume it as much of a political text as it seems to be now. I mean, it's hard to talk about this without getting too deep into what the book is about. But in general, I think all art's political. It's hard to rob it of that element. As a person who is not from the United States, my role or my intention with this book is not really to provide commentary on what's happening there. It's more just to catalog it. Because I lived in the United States for a number of years. I have a lot of experience with particularly the United States immigration process, because I tried to immigrate and was denied and had to be told to leave the country and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think I knew that I wanted to write a memoir, and to me, the best memoirs are the best nonfiction books, especially the best memoirs. They look back at an experience and then try to understand why that experience was so important to the person who's writing. And to me, my experiences on the trail were all a part of this longer thread of being totally obsessed with the United States of America from childhood. And the book, talks a lot about my childhood and moving to America and being asked to leave, et cetera, et cetera. And so, even if Trump had not gotten into office, this book, I'd still be making this book. It's just with that lens now in front of it, it seems like a much more pointed, I guess, quote unquote timely thing to be writing about. Mm-hmm. It's kind of coincidence, to be honest.
Interesting. Now, you have a background in self-published mini comics of your shorter work being included in various collections, anthologies. Over the past couple of years, though, I mean, you've had books published by larger presses. Permanent Press, for example, comes out from Avery Hill, and then How to Survive in the North, and then your new book, as you just mentioned, will be coming out from Nobrow. So you've been getting more distribution and more attention through the books that you've come out with over the past 2 years. And I'm wondering how that has perhaps changed your perspective of the comics medium, or more specifically, your own relationship with comics as a medium. And again, I ask this within the context of Permanent Press and your mock autobiographical figure, Luke Healy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my thoughts about comics and comics making have changed so hugely over the last few years, in part because it's become more of a real job for me. And partly when you sit down and you make pages and pages and pages and pages of comics, you're necessarily forced to consider them a lot more. In terms of the actual work that I'm making and the work that I'm interested in making, I think that everybody who is a creative person wants to make the best work possible. They want to make the best comics. They want to make the best music, blah, blah, blah. You want to make the best comics. But I think more and more as I work on stuff, I realize, and I try to focus in on that, I'm trying to make the best comics according to my own tastes, which is what makes the work different from, everybody else's work. And so I think that like I've consciously made the choice over the last number of years to really like interrogate and develop my own taste, try to understand why I like what I like, why I don't like what I don't like, and try to make the most sort of like refined, perfect version of that. And when I talk to, sometimes I get emails and stuff from students who are in art school, and they're like, they've been given an assignment, to interview a professional. And the thing that I always say is like, be conscious of your tastes, and really work on understanding and developing it. And I think for me, that's been the like biggest revelation over the last few years. And I think that every book that I make is like closer and closer to like really matching my taste in like a conscious, perfect way. I'm sure I'll never get there because your taste changes all the time. But I think that what's interesting to me about publishing How to Survive in the North and then publishing Cuckoo's Nest with publishing Permanent Press with these larger presses is that I'm only more and more interested in making work that is purely like an expression of my own taste. And I think that's what's so interesting about that is that people are continually willing to publish that. I think a lot of creators, and maybe justly so, and they probably sell a lot better than I do, are more concerned with, or certainly a little more conscious, at least, of the appeal that work might have to other people, to readers. But I think for me, the more that I truly try to like express something that is just a part of my own taste, the more that people seem to respond to it positively. Sorry, that was such a lengthy, winding answer, but yeah, I don't know.
No, it does answer the question, because I'm also aware that not only are you a creator, but, and you state this on your website, that you're also a colorist. And some of the people that you have worked with as a colorist are quite impressive. Lucy Nisley, Abby Howard, John Chad, and then Carolyn Nowak. And these are some of the creators that we've discussed on the Comics Alternative at one or more times. And so I would guess that even with your work as a colorist, this sense of taste, of the kind of things that you want to be associated with, the kind of things, the kind of comics narratives that you want to work on is quite important to you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like I'm probably too precious for my own good, but definitely I the thing about comics is they take a lot of time to make. There's like no way around it. You can try to get faster and faster, but at the end of the day, you just have to like plop your butt in a chair and like actually work on them for hours and hours for like not that much money. And if I wanted to work on stuff that I, didn't kind of care all that much about, because it was a little bit more like financially viable, I'd get a day job, because there's no comics grind where you make the kind of money that you could like per hour that you could compare it to like an actual, like 9 to 5. So I would do that. I think like a great freedom of working freelance is you get to pick your gigs most often. Not that I'm like turning down work. Please, if anybody wants to hire me for some freelance work, do get in touch. But, if I'm pitching stuff like to the Nib, for example, they've published a couple things that I've done. I just pitched them a comic then, and they had to, come back to me and say like, sorry, like this is too specific. We're not that interested in publishing this. Like that's still the stuff that I'm going to keep pitching, the kind of thing that like maybe we'll get a no more often than it'll get a yes, because at the end of the day, like you only have so much time. Might as well like use it making the projects that you're interested in. Or get a day job. And trust me, I'm always on the edge of getting a day job. I could really use some more money.
Well, if anyone listening to this wants to hire Luke, then they should definitely check out his website, lukehealy.com. That's one word, Luke Healy. And they can find the contact information and check out your work and, ask you, hey, you want to color something? You want to work for me? So
yeah, please do. I'm not as picky as I just made myself sound. Trust.
Yeah. Well, Luke, I want to thank you again for coming back on the Comics Alternative, and best of luck with finishing up both Peeping Tom and this longer project for Nobrow, Americana.
Oh, thank you so much.
I want to thank Luke Healy for coming back on the Comics Alternative to discuss his new book from Avery Hill Publishing, Permanent Press. It was fun talking with him again, and I look forward to those new works that he had mentioned, the mini-comic Peeping Tom and next year's book, Americana. Perhaps we can have him back on the show to discuss those. And if you enjoy the kind of comics that Luke Healy creates, then check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. In addition to comics from the mainstream, every month you'll find great discounts on alternative and lesser-known titles, the kind of comics you'll find from Luke and others published by Avery Hill. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Luke Healy. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I am Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, Slack, Discord, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We've got more interviews lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.